I'm in an interesting position at Backdoors where I get to do a lot of the cloud assessments. And I ended up spending a lot of time focused on M365 over the last, few years even. And I ended up diving into some very specific attack surface elements in M365 that I wanted to create a tool for. And through that, it ended up spiraling and out of control really, and it became like the rabbit hole that just never stopped. And through that, it ended up becoming a much bigger project than I initially anticipated it being. But anyways, the gist of this whole talk is that we made a post-exploitation tool for M365 or Microsoft Intra ID accounts, if you will. So today we're going to walk through pretty much everything that it does. I got lots of demos to show you. We're going to talk about some unique attack paths that I think maybe some things you may not have seen before, maybe you have. Lots of this stuff that I'm going to show you exploits the default settings in M365 tenants.
By design.
All right, so we are, I am Beau Bullock. This is Steve Borosh. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Steve Borosh. I've been at Black Hills for about 2.5 years now. Red team, pen test, pivots, things like that. But now I'm doing continuous pen testing, so always in your environment, always wrecking your house with GraphRunner now. So excited to be here. This is some cool stuff. I came in a little late on this project. Basically, I went through a research slump and met with Beau at a coffee shop one day, and he showed me some stuff, and I was like, oh, that's cool. I ran it through Burp. I said, well, what about this thing over here? And he's like, oh, I've never seen that before. So I did some stuff, and now it's in here, and I'm just riding his coattails. So,
yeah. So, so for me, I've been here for 10 years now, John. Isn't that crazy? So I like I said, I get to do a lot of the cloud assessments. I get to do a lot of the cool like emerging threat stuff. But also I teach a cloud hacking class, which I taught a few days ago. So let's just get into it because there's a lot. All right, so first off, I'm going to talk about what GraphRunner is. Then we're going to go through some very specific attacks against authentication, recon, and enumeration. I'm going to show you some potentially tricky, maybe hard to identify persistence mechanisms we can use this tool for. And then I'm going to show you how we can pillage accounts with GraphRunner. All right, so first off, what is it? Like I said, it's a post-exploitation tool. So this tool is 100% after you have phished somebody or stolen credentials, right? So nothing in this tool will help you to get that initial access. But once you do, this is the next step. When we do red team assessments, a lot of times we're doing like device code phishing. We're doing credential harvesting via session enumeration type phishing attacks. So this tool would go hand in hand with one of those attacks where you have compromised an account via phishing, and now you are wondering what you can do in the account. It primarily leverages the Graph API, right? This is the whole point. And honestly, throughout this talk, you're going to see it's kind of been a journey of R&D into the Graph API, but also into some undocumented APIs that I will show you here in a sec. It has modules for all kinds of fun stuff after the fact. All right, so it has multiple moving pieces. First off, the majority of it is in PowerShell. So the primary functions and the usability is in the PowerShell script itself. It also has a little GUI, which I'll show you. And then finally, it has a set of OAuth tools to help you complete OAuth flow in an automated fashion when you phish somebody with something like an illicit consent grant attack. All right, Microsoft Graph API. You want to talk about the Graph API?
sure. Graph API, leveraged by cloud services. So there's a few API versions, so 2 and 1. You can do things like search objects in Azure, Substrate, things like that, like Teams, SharePoint, email. If you send a file in Teams, you can search in there through SharePoint because it's all pretty much the same thing. So now everything's Entra ID, so we've had to rewrite our freaking tools to rename everything. But Graph API has been the new authentication piece that we're targeting. So Microsoft also is coming out with some new protections against this, but we're still able to go to the old Graph API and maybe talk about that some other time. But yep.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how powerful the Graph API actually is. And a lot of people don't realize that you can do pretty much anything in an Intra ID account with the Graph API. Read emails, send emails, find files in SharePoint, exploit group-based issues, which we're going to do here in a bit. All right, so first section, authentication. So like I mentioned, this is a post-compromise tool, so we need to be able to authenticate, right? And that could be, the way that looks could be, we phish somebody, we have a session in a browser, right? Maybe we do a device code auth.
Real quick on device code auth. So if you're not familiar with the device code flow, let's say you have a TV in your house and you go to sign up for Netflix and it says, oh, hey, do you want to sign in from a computer or a browser instead of trying to type the whole password into the key remote? So you go to your browser, you go to like netflix.com/device or whatever, or microsoft.com/device login, and it prompts you for that code. You enter the code, you enter your password if you have to, your multi-factor, and then whoever generated that initial request for the code gets your authentication package. So that's kind of what we're doing here.
So the first piece of this is we need to get tokens. So we have to be able to authenticate GraphRunner. And to do that, device code auth is a great way to do it. It also contains modules for authenticating as an Azure app as well, so an app registration, which I will show you. So get-graph tokens is the main module to get those tokens. It just does a simple device code auth so that you can go and have a variable where your tokens are stored. Because the rest of the modules are going to rely on the fact that you have tokens available. In terms of recon, all right, so GraphRunner has a number of modules that will help you identify a lot of the other issues that we're going to look at exploiting later on. A lot of those default issues. So first off, it has modules for enumerating configurations, so user settings and things that users can do. Things like, can users consent to apps? Can users create apps? Can users create groups? A lot of those default settings that a lot of times, you may not really consider how high risk they are because, a lot of times you'll say, oh yeah, best practice say, don't let people create groups. But what does that actually mean? And what is the risk there? That's really at the heart of what we want to show you with this tool is what you can actually do to show how we can actually exploit a lot of those default issues. Dumps conditional access policies. So it has a nice ability to collect conditional access policies so you can review those. Gathers apps and consent approvals. So this is my blue team app for you. So, a lot of what I'm going to show you is, very much on the offensive side, but my module for helping you identify malicious apps is in there as well. All right. So invoke graph recon. So this module will, if you've ever used the MS Online PowerShell module, there's a command called get-company information. So this pulls similar information to that, where you get things like the directory settings, things like the authorization policy. So again, this information contains information around things like can users create groups, can you create applications, which we'll dive into why those are important here in a sec. But one thing that I found through research, and honestly just people ask us all the time, how do you find crap like this? It's literally just open up Burp and put it in between you and the Azure portal.
And that's not even just browser traffic. I open it and direct all my stuff. So open Teams client, and then you can see what all APIs and things that's hitting, Skype. So
yeah. So in just kind of poking around, ended up finding this undocumented API called Estimate Access. And if you Google it, there's nothing about it out there. The Estimate Access API, it's on Graph. But basically, it is an endpoint that you can submit an action to. So an action could be anything like, can I modify a group? Can I create a user? And I, just from research, built this list of over 400 actions. And so the tool has this ability to basically enumerate by directly calling this Estimate Access API, so you can determine exactly what you have access to. Dumping conditional access policies. As an attacker, this can be useful after we've gained access to a credential, so we can identify other potential entry points or other potential loopholes in conditional access policies that we may be able to exploit with another credential. Dumping apps. So this module will dump all app registrations, including enterprise apps, as well as the consent that users have granted to those apps. So you can go through and say, oh, I have users that consented to this external third-party app that reads their email, right? That'd be something you may want to investigate. I also included a module to carry out an attack that I incorporated into a tool that I wrote called Mail Sniper years ago, which basically exploits the fact that users of Exchange, users of Outlook, can give access to their inbox to anyone in the company. So if you didn't know that, it's something that is actually a really bad problem. So by default, any user can right-click their inbox, go to permissions, and change the default settings so that literally anybody in the organization can read their email. And I know that sounds like a terrible idea. Why would anybody do that? But people do it. And so what this means is that after an attacker compromises a credential, it becomes very, very easy for us to identify these shared mailboxes. So previously with Mail Sniper, this was doing it over the OA or EWS, Exchange Web Services. But now with GraphRunner, we're doing the exact same thing, but via the Graph API, right? So, we don't necessarily need access to EWS. We don't need access to OA. We just need a Graph token.
All right, so invoke root client ID access. So in Azure and Microsoft 365, there are client IDs that identify different services and things out there. So if we only have access to a certain one like we sign in with Graph API, right? And we see that we have a specific scope and a specific client ID that we use. Well, what happens if we can see if we have other scope or more permissions on other client IDs? So I wrote a quick tool to just basically brute force those or go through those and then spit out which client IDs have what kind of roles you have on there, read, write, user read, whatever. And then you can, with this tool, or introduce token tactics, which is another tool that I wrote, you can swap those tokens for those additional client IDs and then assume those roles for other applications.
All right, groups. So we're going to get into kind of the meat of what this tool does now. All right, so first off, if you didn't know it, groups in Microsoft 365 can be made public. And what that means is that any user can modify those groups in your directory. So a great example of this is if you go to Teams and you click Create Team. There's a few things that happen when you click Create Team. First off, it will create the Teams channel, right? But also create a SharePoint site and a Microsoft 365 group. And when any user in your domain goes to do this, they're presented with a question. Do you want to make it private? Which means that they have to manually add users to it, which is too much work for most people, right? Like everyone wants it to be public. So they click public, which means that now anybody can actually join that group. There's also scenarios where groups that are other types of groups, so the security groups, can also be made public as well. So what this means is that as an attacker, if you authenticate to Microsoft 365, you can begin to enumerate all of these other groups that you may be able to actually add yourself to. And in practice, right, we've tested this on a number of customers now where we are finding that we'll run this. I'm about to show you a demo here in a second. We'll find that there's like 50 groups at a company that we can join and be a part of.
Right, and so I'm not sure what the administrators are doing there, but yeah, so I'm kind of running this. I told you I'm on the continuous pen testing, so I'm always in these environments. So we do our other graph tools and enumerating and things like that. And we don't see this kind of ability to join groups. That's what's so powerful about GraphRunner, because run this in an environment and it just explodes on your screen of groups that you can add and remove from and stuff, and it's crazy.
Yeah, so I did this like last week and found an IT group that I was able to add myself to. And I got dropped in a Teams chat with the IT admins talking about local admin passwords in clear text. Like they're just passing it back and forth. So this is a potential privilege escalation attack that we can now do with GraphRunner. All right, so the module in GraphRunner is called get-updatable groups. Again, this one uses the estimate access API. This is that undocumented one. So what's interesting about that is that in Teams or in SharePoint, if you log in, you can see those Microsoft 365 groups that have been made public. But what you don't see are the private ones where you have a configuration that has been made around your account specifically to have certain permissions on it. But via the estimate access API, we can find every group, no matter if it's just a Microsoft 365 group, that allows us to modify them. So what this means is that not only can we add ourselves, but this means we can also add guest users or other users that we want to add to the group as well. Dynamic groups. All right, so this one's fun. So if you haven't seen this one might freak you out. All right, so in Microsoft 365, you can create groups with what are called membership rules. And what that does is it allows admins to easily kind of group certain users with certain attributes, or maybe they work from a certain location, right? So like, let's say I wanted to create a group with my entire team from India, and every time that a user got the attribute that their location is India, we automatically add them to this group. Or what if I had a group where I wanted to add all my admins, and to do that, I made sure that I added any user that had admin in their name or username. So that would look something like this, right? Top right there, we have a rule syntax for user.userPrincipleName - contains admin, right? Nobody would ever get the name admin in their email in my environment, right? Well, what if I invite a guest that has admin in the email address? So what happens is that rule will trigger, and it will add my guest user that has admin in the email address directly to that new admin group. So get-dynamic groups. So this is the module for finding these. What it does is it will identify any groups that have membership rules and show you the membership rules. And then from there, it takes some analysis, right? You have to go through and see if there's anything you can abuse about it. A lot of times we see groups that have membership rules based off of user attributes. Like I mentioned, the location. Sometimes it's device type. Sometimes it's email address like this, right? All right, demo time. All right, so this first demo, we're going to show how to authenticate with GraphRunner. So first off, we're going to import the module, run get-graph tokens, and perform the device code auth. So again, like at this point, we phish somebody, right? We have a browser session as them. We're going to leverage that already authenticated session to validate or to authenticate our tool set, right? So it's typical device code flow, right? So now we have we have tokens associated with that user account. So let's look at the groups, right? So on the groups, let's check for updatable groups in this environment. So get-updatable groups, -tokens, $tokens. So you pass the tokens variable to it, and all of a sudden you see that we have a number of groups that are updatable. So at this point, each one of these, I can add myself to, I can add other users to. And what that means is we get access to SharePoint sites associated with these groups. We get access to Teams channels associated with these groups. And if there's other interesting things like maybe conditional access policies around them, we may be able to abuse those. All right, so this current group does not have my my Deckard user, right? So you'll probably notice the Blade Runner theme here. So I'm authenticated as Deckard, right? So if I want to add myself to that group, we could do it through the Azure portal, but the Azure portal is locked down a lot of times. So GraphRunner lets us do it through the Graph API directly. So invoke-add group member. We need the group ID associated with the group that we want to add ourselves to. And then finally, we just need our user object ID. So in the token itself, you can find your user object ID. We also have a few modules to get those as well. And all of a sudden, member added successfully. So if you look at Teams, we didn't have access to the next-gen Teams chat, but now let's verify that we are added to that group first, and then we'll go back and look at the Teams to see if we get a new one. So we should see a new one pop up there. Now we have next-gen team, right? So we just basically added ourselves to a group and got access to a brand new Teams channel that we did not have access to previously. All right, get-dynamic groups. So this is the module to go and find those dynamic groups. In this case, we see that example I had on the slide there, right? User.userPrincipleName contains admin. So let's go see if we could exploit this in some way, right? If we invited a guest with admin in the name, how would that look? So we go to the groups. This particular one is called dynamic admin group, right? So we'll go to the dynamic admin group, and let's look at the members. So in the members, we see that, oh, hey, there's already a Proton Mail account in there that's called testadmin at proton.me.
Totally not part of our organization.
So what I did there is just invite a guest user that had admin in the name. The rule triggered and automatically added them to that group. Persistence. How can we maintain access to the M365 account, right? An evasive engagement or an actual threat actor, that's a very, very important process or piece of the attack flow, right? Is to maintain that access. You know, honestly, attacking's not easy, right?
Well, yeah, it's hard, but with these tokens, we have to keep in mind that our access token we get is good for 1 hour by default, but our refresh tokens are good for 90 days. So this stuff is good to keep refreshing and stay in the environment until that is revoked.
Yeah, so through this section, we're going to exploit the default settings in Microsoft 365 environments for creating groups, for inviting guests, and creating apps. All right, so first off, let's talk about groups. So why should you worry that a user in your environment can create a security group? So again, by default, anyone can create groups in your tenant. So first off, why would you care? So first off, the group pollution issue or shadow IT, right? So what if like any user just started creating like millions of groups? Like that'd be a bad day, right? You don't want to go clean that up. But secondly, what about watering hole attacks? What about what if I created a group that appears to be named something similar to what you already have? And what if I could exploit the fact that admins sometimes make mistakes and maybe they click the wrong group? I could add myself to that group and potentially build a ruse around it and maybe get added to some policy somewhere. It's long-term threat actor thinking, right? It's the long game.
Yeah, which we're playing in the the long-term testing that we're doing. So just kind of waiting.
Yeah. So I was playing around with this and this concept, and I started thinking like, all right, well, what if I created like a dev group that matches dev? And then I was like, oh, okay, well, what if I just try to name it the exact same thing in the portal? And so in the Azure portal, if you go to try to name a group the exact same thing, it won't let you create the exact identical name, but you can add a space on the end, so that's something. But via the Graph API, you can create an identical named group to what is already existing in that environment. And this module, invoke-security group cloner, what it does is it will find the members of the group you want to clone, add them to the group, and yourself. And got another demo for you to show how this looks. So looking at the groups again, maybe we try to pick one to target. Maybe it's admins, right? Administrator group. So if we run the invoke-security group cloner module, it will go and try to identify all the groups as well as the members of the groups. And we'll ask you, enter the group name you want to clone. And so in this case, like I said, we're going to clone the administrators group. It currently only has 3 members, Rachel, Tyrell, and Roy. And so we're going to copy that name, paste it in, and found group administrators. Do you want to add your current user to the clone group? Yes. Do we want to add other users? You could if you wanted to. Like, let's say you wanted to add a guest user, you could. And then finally, it creates a group. So now if we refresh the portal here, we see we have 2 administrators groups, right? One of these has 3 users, the other one has 4. So now, if we go, yeah, so this is the one that has 4, right? So this is the one we just created that has us in it. The other one, the original, only has 3. So, again, how would this look to an admin, right? Yeah, how would you exploit that? So let's say that I'm an admin now, right? And I'm going to configure permission or a role around a resource. So I go to the Azure portal, I go to access control, and you know what? I want to add the admins as an owner of the storage account or whatever this is. So go to the role assignment. The admin's like, oh yeah, they need to be owner. They're admins. Why not, right? So we're going to do a privileged admin role, make it an owner, and then you go to members, right? So now we're going to select the members of the group we want to add, and all of a sudden there's 2 admins groups, right? So what do? You add both of them, right? So what I'm trying to show here is that you can create these like doppelganger type groups, right? Very easily. And you could play the long game, wait it out and see what happens as an attacker, or build a ruse around it and try to get
fish your way in, say, hey, I noticed I was in this group, something like that. Yep.
Same thing on the, let's say we want to do the same thing on the SharePoint side. Like, there's nothing identifiable about that, right? It just says administrators, Like, is the admin actually going to go dig into that and see, like, which one is legit?
It should show the members right there, who's in it, right, on the same line. It doesn't.
Yeah. All right, guest users. So, by default, any user in your environment can invite guests to your tenant as well. Now, I would say, historically speaking, guest users haven't really, like, gotten the notoriety around, like, being a huge issue.
Right.
Yeah, and what I want to show is a couple things where we can actually leverage groups to give guest users more access than really they should. So first off, attacker persistence, user inventory, right? Like what if I invited 1 million guests, right? Like that's not going to be a fun cleanup. And then group-based privilege escalation. All right, so first off, invoke-invite guests is a fairly straightforward module to invite a guest user through the Graph API. By default, if a user or a guest user logs into the portal, they actually can't see much anymore. Like historically, you'd see at least the directory, so users and groups, that kind of thing. But now, Microsoft has kind of toned it back a little bit. Guest users can't really see that stuff. But if you combine the ability to invite guests with the ability to update groups, that actually becomes really, really interesting.
Why is there a guest user in my administrators group?
So what that means is that not only can we invite guest users, but we can add them to those updatable groups, which means that as the guest user, we can access those SharePoint sites, those Teams chats, right? So think of it this way. If I was trying to persist as an attacker and I get kicked out of my account, but I already invited a guest, are you going to go investigate that I invited a guest? If you're not looking at guest users, I may have a very, very long time of having access to your Teams chats and SharePoint environment just purely through a guest user. So like in the screenshot here, basically I'm just showing that as a guest user, I added myself to this Tyrell Corp group and was able to still enumerate users because the group itself has the directory, and then also view those Teams chats. All right, OAuth apps. All right, so I'm going to give you the 5-minute pitch on what OAuth apps are, because it is a very deep topic. We can get really, really in the weeds with it. But in general, applications in Azure, they're there for a number of reasons, but usually they're built around authenticating users to other websites. So for example, you could integrate an OAuth app that authenticates a Microsoft user to a custom web application. Alternatively, you can create applications that have permissions to do things in the context of a user.
Oh, we saw that in brute client IDs access, right? So you can see the other ones and what scope you had on, right?
Yeah, and so this was a thing that was heavily used for phishing about 5 or 6 years ago. It was an attack called illicit consent grant attacks. And what that meant is that an attacker would create a multi-tenanted application in Microsoft 365, which means that any user in other tenants could consent to it, and then grant that application permissions to do things like read email. So it'd be something like mail.read as a permission. And historically speaking, this was used to phish because it was very, very non-malicious looking. So in most phishing cases, you have, is it going to take my password? Is it asking me to enter a credential? Is it asking me to go to some weird domain? Am I being asked to download a file? But in illicit consent grant attack, you point a victim at a Microsoft Online URL, they navigate to it, and they get this consent page, right? And the consent page just says, I'm requesting permissions within your account. And all they have to do is click accept. And when they click accept, that application now has the ability to carry out requests to the Graph API based off of what the user consented to. So in the case of like reading email, if that application had mail.read, then that application now has the ability to read emails. But since the phishing, I don't know, like
basically we used it and now they're protecting against it.
Yeah, Microsoft decided to kind of cut that off, so unverified applications can't really do that anymore from an external context. There is still one interesting permission you can do from an unverified app, and that's user.readbasic.all. So with an unverified app, you still can phish with an illicit consent grant attack using user.readbasic.all, which is not too much, but it does give you the directory. There are also a number of well-known applications as well. So first off, the Graph Explorer is actually a really useful tool as well. So in a lot of cases, you might not be able to deploy an application like I'm about to show you to a tenant. But the Graph Explorer, as a trusted application, a lot of times, you can go consent to that and still leverage tools like GraphRunner to talk to the Graph API. So the ability to create apps. So this is, again, a default setting in M365, right? By default, your users can create app registrations within your own tenant. So they can make those applications with permissions. Now, basic users can't add permissions that do more administrative tasks, right? Like, so normal users can't create an application that can modify the directory. But they can create apps that read their email, they'll read SharePoint, they can create apps that do a number of other very, very useful things from a persistence standpoint. So in terms of persistence, what we would do is after we compromise an account, authenticate with GraphRunner, deploy or inject an app, give it a scope of permissions, and then we consent to it with our compromised account. And so now we have a module called invoke-inject OAuth app. And what this does is it packages up that whole process of deploying an app registration, giving it the scope, and also setting up, it also gives you the commands you need to complete the OAuth flow. All right, so another demo for you. All right, so in this demo, we're going to do the app injection. So again, compromise an account, right? And we want to persist in that account. So invoke-inject OAuth app, we have to give it a couple things. We have to give it an app name. So in this case, I'm going to call it WinDefend for M365. Seems like a, pretty good name. We got to give it a reply URL. So in an OAuth flow, when a user clicks consent, they get redirected somewhere. And that redirect is where ultimately the OAuth flow happens, where they can gain access to access tokens. So in this case, I'm just pointing it at localhost because we're not trying to phish somebody with this, right? We're going to basically just consent to it ourselves. In this case, you see the scope of permissions up top, and we get a few URLs here. So we get the actual phishing URL in green, or let me rephrase that, the actual consent URL in green, as well as this command at the bottom called invoke-auto-OAuth flow. What that does is it spins up a very basic web listener on your local host and will complete the OAuth flow for you when you click consent. So as an attacker trying to persist, we can quickly go in and consent to our own app. So in the browser now, so we got a listener on our local host.
Joffers up here.
We've got the we've got the link in green, right? So that link in green is that Microsoft Online URL. And look, you can see, like, this app has a lot of permissions, right? All of those permissions are let me rephrase that. None of those permissions require admin consent. And as soon as we consented to it, it redirected our browser to localhost. The invoke auto OAuth flow module completed the OAuth flow for us, and now we have a set of app tokens. So these tokens are scoped to the application, but using the context of the user. So now we could run something like invoke graph open inbox finder. So the module I mentioned earlier, where you can search for other email addresses that have shared their mailboxes. So in this case, we get our own Deckard, right? So of course we can read our own email, but additionally, there's another inbox, Roy at tyrellcorporation.io, is also readable. So we could use the get-inbox module to go and pull all of Roy's emails. So we haven't gotten to that one yet, but it does have functionality, just like Mail Sniper, to pull emails. So why would that be useful? Why would creating an app be useful for persistence? Well, first off, if a user that we've compromised simply changes their password, right, to kick us out of their account, they're like, oh, I got phished, I'm just going to change my password, I'm good. It does not kill the app, right? As the app registration, I can still access that user's account. And what it takes is the admin or the user to actually go and revoke all sessions. So as soon as I go and revoke all sessions, what happens is the refresh token gets killed immediately, but the access token itself will stay alive as long as it was scoped for. So by default, it's an hour.
What if during that hour you made another app? What if during that hour you made another application backdoored? Could you do that?
You could, but it'd still be under the app or under the user's session. So if they revoked all sessions, it'd still die. So you remember a couple slides back, I was talking about how external unverified apps can't really be abused much anymore, right? Well, what about internal apps? So I just showed you how we could deploy an app for persistence, right? What if we deployed an app just like that and we scoped it to mail.read, right? To read somebody's email. It turns out that within a tenant, you actually can still consent to other more permissive actions. Think of this scenario, right? So we already phished somebody maybe with a session stealing type attack, right? We're in their browser. We use GraphRunner to inject an app, or 5 apps for that matter. We can make one to read email. We can make one to read SharePoint, make one to read Teams, make one to do directory stuff. So we inject those, and they're not going to go away unless an admin goes and actually deletes those apps, right? They will live there. Within that tenant, we have all the information we need to leverage that to carry out a phishing attack, an actual illicit consent grant attack against other users. So an example, like the URL here on the screen, is what that looks like. So login.microsoftonline.com. How many people are going to think that's malicious, right? You go to that URL, you click accept, and all of a sudden now the attacker has access to read your email. Looks like illicit consent grant is back on the menu, boys. All right, pillage. So this is actually a really big section that we haven't, I haven't talked about it publicly at all yet. Is the fact that GraphRunner has so many pillaging modules and capabilities. So first off, searching and exporting of email, right? If you know my history with email, with Mail Sniper, that was something that is a very important piece to me. Searching and downloading of files from SharePoint and OneDrive. Searching and exporting Teams chats. And then finally, we'll talk about user attributes as well. So first off, searching mailbox. Search your current user's email for terms. So you can search things like passwords, right? And export them and have a nice little GUI to look at. So you can actually scroll through and actually load that HTML content for emails. Or you can actually just export the latest messages from an inbox. So if you wanted to get all the latest messages, you can use the get-inbox module. Same thing on the Teams side. So invoke-search Teams will search Teams messages for specific terms. So this would be a great tool to use if you want to try to identify where users are passing back sensitive data, right, back and forth via Teams. Or you can just export full conversations. So if you want to get the full chat log for specific users, you can do that too. That is the get-Teams chat module. User attributes. So invoke-search user attributes. So this topic of having secrets and attributes is something that has been around a long time. So historically speaking, the thing that we would notice on engagements, on internal domains, is that occasionally things like passwords would end up in attributes tied to users. So meaning that if you were to just list out all the user attributes tied to a user in the domain, in your Active Directory domain, you may find things like passwords in there. Same thing happens in the Azure side. So what this module does is it just goes and pulls every bit of information that Azure has for you, all the attributes, and then searches through them for terms like passwords. So like in the example on the screen, I just search for password, and we see temp password equals secret intern pass 123.
Yeah, so this one has been the one that I've been heavily focused on in my work. So search SharePoint and OneDrive. So it's using the Graph API with KQL, so you can use that language to query. So you do things like search term, password star, and then you can provide the file type that you're looking for. If you have browser access, you can go browse around the SharePoint sites and then see, maybe find files. Oh, I want to look where that one is, find the drive ID and the file ID for it. That's what this can do. So you can find the files and what locations they're on. And then you can optionally download them. It might say no. And then we have some other things we can do, like invoke immersive file reader. Who's heard of immersive file reader out there? Anybody? Yeah, a little thing out there.
There's a couple.
SharePoint.
Yeah, there's a couple out there.
Yeah. So if you go on SharePoint and you find a text file, you can hover over it and click on it. And let's say you're on an unmanaged device like my VM at home, and I have Firefox running when all they want to do is run Edge in their environment. I can then search for the files that I want to open on SharePoint previously, grab the file ID and the drive ID, feed that to Immersive File Reader, and what it does, it's actually the text-to-speech API. So the text-to-speech API reads the file for you with its authentication. So what you can do is say, all right, I couldn't open this file, I couldn't download this file, but Immersive File Reader will pull it for me. And not just text files, but any other file type too.
How many people have heard of Snappler? Yeah, so if you haven't heard of Snappler, what it is, it's a tool that basically searches through shares on a network for interesting files. And it will try to find things like private keys, AWS keys, documents with passwords in them and whatnot. So basically, we ended up making Snappler, but for SharePoint and Teams and email. Demo number 4 here. All right, so we're going to use the get-SharePoint URLs module just to show that we can list out all these SharePoint sites that are available to us, first of all, which can be a very useful recon technique, right? Just to understand what sites do we even have access to in the first place. And we're going to use the invoke-search SharePoint and OneDrive module. So the cool thing about the search API is that when you use the Graph Search API, you don't have to target a specific site. It will search everything you have visibility into. So every site. So in this case, I searched for password, I think. And I'm trying to download this javadb.jsp file or whatever. And I'm getting denied, right? It says remote server returned an error. So this is exactly what Steve was just mentioning, where there's these files that download is blocked. This is actually a really common thing where organizations are starting to block downloads via SharePoint.
Yeah, you have to be on a managed device, right? Either enrolled in MDM or Azure Join or whatever.
Right, so can't download this credentials.xml file, can't download this aws-credentials.txt file. Let's go look in the SharePoint directory itself. I know it's small, but it says your organization's security policy doesn't allow you to download. Access blocked. You can't actually download files in the browser either. But what Steve here found.
So invoke Immersive File Reader, right? It actually uses a URL like media p1 dot some weird domain. But I found that by running Burp Suite and proxying all my traffic through, enumerating Beau's site, and then figured it out.
So with the Immersive File Reader module, you need the drive ID and the file ID, which you can get from that previous search command that we just leveraged. So with the drive ID and file ID, so we're grabbing the file ID now. With the Immersive File Reader module, let's see what happens. So there's files we could not download previously, right? All of a sudden, we can read them now.
Woo!
So Immersive File Reader there. So to show you kind of like that kind of like Snappler-like ability, we can use GraphRunner. So there's a module called Invoke GraphRunner, which we'll talk about here in a second. But what it does is it leverages a detector file. A lot of those detectors I pulled directly from Snappler as well. I just modified them to fit the graph KQL format. And as you can see, it's finding things like unattended install files, AWS private keys. It'll export all of that to a nice Excel spreadsheet for you, where you will have the detector name that actually triggered, the file name of the files that you found, the drive item ID and file ID if you want to go download those, the location, so like the actual like URL on SharePoint where they're located, as well as like the size, so you don't go downloading like a, I don't know, terabyte file or whatever. So the last thing is there's a GUI. So when you're doing a pen test and you're phishing users, especially with the way Microsoft's tokens system works, we're oftentimes looking at an access token, a refresh token. And yes, the API-based requests are great, but occasionally, just being able to click through a user's email, click through OneDrive, becomes really, really useful. So ended up writing a very, very minimal, very basic GUI, but it's nice because you can quickly send custom API requests. You can enumerate users and groups. You can read and search and send email. You can read shared email through it. You can read and send Teams messages through it. And finally, you can go through and click through the user's SharePoints in OneDrive. So final demo here. Quick kind of look at the GUI. So up top, we have an access token field. So literally, you just copy your access token. It's already authenticated. We're going to paste it in the top. You can see it's terribly coded. I'm sorry, but usability-wise, it's nice. So we got to get our token. So in this case, I'm running $apptokens.access_token to get the access token for the authenticated session I have. Going to paste it in the access token field. You can parse that token. So if you've ever used like JWT.io, same kind of concept, right? Parsing the token so we can see the app name, the user that it's scoped to, as well as the scope, which is really, really important. So in the Graph API, you have to have certain scope to do certain things, right? So if you want to read email, you have to have things like mail.read. All right, so you can list the users, you can list groups, we can read a user's email. So if you click fetch emails, it'll fetch all the latest emails for the user. You can click on them, and it will load them up for you, so we can scroll down and actually see the content of those emails, right? Oh, by the way, when you access emails through the Graph API like this, they do not get marked as read in the user's inbox. So you as the attacker can click around and read email all day long, and they'll never get marked as read. You can read shared email boxes. So remember Roy earlier, we found that Roy had a shared mailbox that we could read, right? So we can fetch emails from his box as well. You can send emails. So if you wanted to send an email, maybe you want to do an internal fish, you can do that. You can pull Teams conversations. So you can pull full Teams conversations. You load them up, and it will load the entire history of that conversation. And you can also send messages to those conversations as well. So if you wanted to inject yourself into a conversation that's already happening, you can do that. And then finally, down below, we've got the OneDrive files and SharePoint files that we can view. So we can load those up with the list files. You can download the files here as well. So for folders, you can dive into folders. You can download files from it, so on and so forth. So anyways, the whole point of it is that if you want to operate fast and you've got access to an access token, you can do that with us. Just quickly, click through an account, enumerate things, view emails, send emails, so on and so forth. So I threw some resources on the end here. This tool is built off of the history of all the Azure things that have happened. Got to give shout outs to Nestori, Dr. Azure AD, with AAD internals, Dirk Jamalima, with Road Tools, the Azure Hound guys, like
Bobby Cook, who helped me with token tactics along that path too.
Yeah, so I guess let me say it definitely pulls in a lot of the same types of attack structures, but hopefully can put it in one place for you. So I got the Cloud Pentest cheat sheets on here too. So I keep a repo of cheat sheets that we use pretty often. And I need to make the repo live, so let's do that. Let's make it live right now.
Drum roll, please.
So change visibility, change to public. I want to make this repository public. Yes, I understand. When your phone is ready, click the button below. Okay, so I gotta get the phone out. All right, click the button. And it's public. Woo! So you should be able to find that at DAPTAC GraphRunner on GitHub. And we also wrote a very lengthy blog post about this whole thing. So I know that we tried to cover a lot here. We wrote like a 47-page.
Yeah, and it includes some of the methodology that we use too. So if you're interested in how we came across that stuff, check it out.
Yeah, so that should be up now on the Black House Infosec blog. I haven't verified that, but it should be there. But we will be around the rest of the conference, but thank you all so much for listening. Hope you guys find the tool useful.